Last, come on. Good job, man, good job. Well done. Welcome to another episode of the Press On podcast, and today we have Stuart Tan. He's a transformational speaker to over 500,000 people worldwide, an NLP practitioner and expert, and also a coach to some of the best business owners and leaders around the world. So today we are going to be interviewing him for us to understand a little bit more about how did he overcome the many challenges in his life to become the success and the leader and the person that he is today. Okay, so Stuart, I do have a couple of questions for you, and I want to get a little bit of a understanding about your backstory. So maybe you can share with us a little bit more about your past and how did it actually help you to become the person that you are today.
Wow, that goes back a long way. I need to go and recall. One of the things I suppose that got me started was in school. I wasn't really that fantastic in my studies. So what took place was a flurry of bad grades. You know what happens when you go from primary 4, you can still get relatively good scores, right? And then it just goes downhill all the way. And in primary 5, I guess my parents didn't really quite feel worried, so they let it ride until the PSLE came out and I nearly got into a normal academic stream. So that was, or what's the equivalent of the normal academic stream. So I ended up thinking that was the norm. You know, I did look at other people like, wow, all these guys in the top class are the creme de la creme, you know. And I just thought I was a normal person. Until my belief was broken by one of my earlier teachers. His name is Ernest Wong, he's a Malaysian trainer. And back then he was running a program for teenagers called Super Teen. At the point of time I was enrolled, actually my parents did give me a choice whether to go for it or not. I was quite fascinated, so they asked me, do you want to go for the preview? So back then they were already running previews. I went in there, it was a holiday camp for 5 days. Wow. So I went in, my parents signed up for it. Back then it was one of the most expensive courses. Get this, $880 was the most expensive course back then, okay? Now it's like $10,000.
Yeah, man, now it's thousands of dollars, crazy.
Yeah, but I was fortunate enough to be able to get in there. And it showed me one key thing, which was what I thought was a limitation of my character or my personality was actually a lack of skills. If I knew how to build the skills, my character could be honed. Right? So think about it, right? Do you have a good memory? Most of us, we say we either have a good or a bad memory, right? Yep. But it's not just that. It's almost like, do you have the skill to have good memory? If you have the skill to get good memory, then everything else is settled. So I realized that it wasn't because I was dumb. It wasn't because I didn't have what it took. It's just that nobody showed me how. So the classic example that I remember being said was, you just take your kid and throw into the swimming pool and then hope that he or she floats. You go through some instruction, you float, and then later on you can paddle. So it was a step-by-step process. And the first thing that was like a mini miracle for me was from close to failing grade, I was a borderline pass, jumped to first position in class within the span of a month.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So it's like something flipped that switch, in your mind that made everything that was impossible become possible for you to achieve that breakthroughs. So after that realization that you could actually do it, going from back of the class to now first in class, tell us a little bit more about your experience with that.
It was quite a surreal experience. And one of the things I remember saying to myself was, wow, if I can do this, then I can do this permanently. So the number one mentality was something quite interesting for me. I never thought I could have a number one mentality. I never knew that I could actually aim high and get it, So that was the starting point where I told myself, okay, from now onwards, I'm going to be top 5.
And was it consistent all the way?
It was consistent until there was one day I got complacent. Once you get complacent, there are a lot of things that will go downhill. I just took it easy because it got so easy getting top grades. It got so easy that I got lazy.
And this was in uni?
This was in Sec 3 actually. I'm glad it happened earlier on for me and not later on. But what happened was that of all the subjects that I was taking, I passed 3. And of the 3, my worst subject, which is Chinese, I passed. Okay, so that was like a double whammy for me. It's like I could have done better. I just didn't put the effort in. And that gave me quite a lot of impetus for growth. I saw how disappointed my parents were because they were expecting me to do well, but then I didn't do well. I remember what my dad said at that point of time. He was disappointed. He said, so what does this show? You got to do something about it. And I did. Let's just say that by that time, I had had my fair share of success and failure. And knowing that I could come back from it was nothing more than a sense of belief within me. So I had a epiphany at that point of time. It's like, it's not so much whether you succeed or fail. It's whether or not you are willing to pick yourself up and hone your character, even if you fail.
Makes
Because
sense.
you can have a successful career, but then you're just an arrogant, piece of whatever. What I find is that it's better to be a failure who learns to progress rather than a success who has no other upper limit to progress to.
Agree. Or rather to also like label yourself as either successful or a failure, when the truth is there's no one or the other, but it's always about a journey or process.
Yeah, so I took that and then I continued to use that throughout the rest of my life, right? And aside from studies, there were other kinds of disappointments that I encountered. Some of them were not as pleasant, I would say. Socially, I was quite inept. I mean, you got to think about it, right? When you're so good in your studies, where do you hang out? You don't hang out with the people. You hang out in the library. So that was my go-to place. So I was habituating that experience to a point where I didn't know how to communicate with people. And that was quite a sad thing. Suffice to say, it cost me my leadership role at one point of time as a student counselor. People didn't respect me. I couldn't bring people to respect me. I could think, but then I couldn't speak, Came to a point where I knew I had to change that as well. So I made a decision. And then eventually now I can't stop talking. 500,000 people plus onwards, and I keep doing it, right? And it's a fun experience. I would say that once I had come to accept that I was poor in those areas, it became quite straightforward what needed to be done.
It does seem as though that personal mastery is something that's very important to you. And some of us watching this might find that they struggle with that aspect, having to juggle so many different responsibilities in their life. And maybe some of the parents as well watching this and thinking about their own kids, right? So what would you say are some of the best ways somebody can actually hone their skills to learn better and maybe to even become better?
That's a question that unfortunately has an infinite number of responses. So you think about it from almost any aspect of life, that it boils down to some principles, but the principles that are being carried out will be manifold. Like for example, the idea of doing whatever it takes. I realize that a lot of people don't quite understand what it means to do whatever it takes. It means all around, not just one sliver. That means you don't just strive for 30 seconds and then that's all it counts, right? You got to go way beyond that. And once you reach that point where you found that you can reach a higher pinnacle, then you go even further beyond that. So like earlier on, we were talking in the car, right? You're saying, okay, doing chin-ups. If every year on year, you do your age of chin-ups times 10, right? Then every year you always get better. So I think the idea of doing whatever it takes has been sorely misunderstood by a lot of people, including myself when I was much younger. So much so that we forget that taking care of ourselves is about doing whatever it takes as well. So passion versus burnout, they are two sides of the same coin actually. So how do we balance that out? Having said that, I think stepping out of the comfort zone is another misnomer. A lot of people think, stepping out of comfort zone means I must be extremely uncomfortable. But that's not true. Yeah. You just need to be uncomfortable at a certain point to be able to say, okay, I've tested it out. I've in fact mastered it. It's not too bad. I can do that again. It's comfortable. Even for fitness, right? When we're stretching ourselves to get to the next level of exercise or the next higher upper limit, we pace ourselves, we keep track, and then we just push ourselves again and again and again, sometimes to failure. So I like to talk about fitness as a metaphor for the mind. You fail because it's good for you. I know that sounds quite stupid, right? I mean, it's like, okay, let's start a business, let's fail. But it doesn't work the way people think.
Correct.
I suspect that pursuing points of failure in your life will make the biggest difference in your life.
I even would go to say as well that these are like a checkpoints in your journey, right? I think a lot of people fear of failure, and that's why they don't take the action. And some of them tell themselves they need to do whatever it takes, push themselves out of the comfort zone, only to end up doing the extremes, right? Yeah. Like we see in business as well, where people burn the entire bridge, leave their jobs or leave whatever thing that they're pursuing so far, just to dive straight into the deep end. But that, I feel so far, and based on my personal experience as well, is a recipe for disaster.
I wouldn't deny that. I think the interesting thing about a recipe is that it works, right? So if it truly is a recipe, then my suggestion is that when you're younger and you can serve yourself this recipe, be a disaster early. because I think it was T.R. Becker who said, every master was once a disaster or something like that. So you might as well be a disaster early, then you can become a master faster.
That's true.
So it's to me, it's almost a contrarian way of thinking. We tend to avoid failure because the social media and the population has educated us into thinking that failure is bad and that mistakes are bad. And we are very badly isolated in Singapore. If you think about it, Singapore is not a place where you take risks, actually. Conversely, you cross the border to Malaysia, right? I've got tons of friends who've lost 10 million and make 10 million back. So to me, I'm not sure whether we are doing ourselves a favor by staying away from failure, staying away from mistakes. That being said, I'm not saying that you pursue failure with all your heart and then you just make sure that, hey, I failed 100 times. What makes probably the difference is the reflection after the failure, so that we know what not to do and we know that this is nothing more than an information gathering process.
Correct. It's a learning process rather than a full stop that this is the end. And I think to add on as well on the topic of risk and being and managing it as well, I think that something I learned many years back before my mentors, right, is that there's a difference between risk and risky, right? A lot of times people think and go for what's risky rather than what's risk, what has a risk, right? Risk is something that you can manage. Risky is basically, risk that cannot be managed. So a lot of times it's always important to have a plan of action before you dive into, let's say, a new project or a new endeavor, so that you understand exactly what might happen and you can plan necessarily.
Risk management, unfortunately, for many people is perceived, or at least sometimes perceived as negative thinking, right? Nobody wants a negative person, but I've raised it to some younger entrepreneurs before. I said, you got to manage your risk, right? You got to make sure that whatever it is that you do, you've got plan B. In fact, the former COO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg, she actually encountered a massive disaster in her life, which was the loss of her husband in 2015. And she wrote a book called Option B, because her therapist said, look, you want your husband back, but option A is no longer there. You got to figure out what option B is. And I think for most of us, we cling to the glories of our past, and then we feed our ego and our identity into that. But once it's lost, it creates a lot more damage than accepting it and moving forward. So one of our challenges, I think, whether it's in entrepreneurship or in life in general, right? Like, look, we had a situation where it was very devastating. We had a couple of people that I actually was responsible for onboarding into my company back then in around about 2003, 2004. And during that time, something happened. I think they found it difficult to work with us, and then they went behind our backs to try and clinch deals. Without being found, but at the same time protecting themselves. So one of them actually got my former business partner to sign a contract to allow them to do anything they wanted with our intellectual property, which was obviously not the case. It was just a lie. So we lost close to about $300,000 of booked sales. That means people cancelled on us. And then we had about $300,000 worth of anticipated sales in the pipeline, but then they were taken from us. Why? Because they positioned themselves as part of the business development process. So you can imagine at your younger days to lose $600,000 is quite a devastating effect. And to stay in disappointment, depression, and anger and resentment is a very poisonous place to be in. So one of our earliest lessons, and I'm glad that it happened when we were much younger, it taught us a little bit of intellectual humility. It taught us to open up, listen, and it also taught us to accept the facts and just move forward. In spite of the fact that, yeah, it's painful, but you can always make money back. You can't always build back relationship.
Yeah. I guess a lot of people, we tend to dwell in the past, we tend to dwell in the failures, and that can actually prevent us from taking the steps forwards, which is necessary for growth, right? I think to draw intention to what we shared earlier about how sometimes failure is not really the end, but it's more so like a stepping stone to where you need to be.
Yeah, actually, talking about that, during that event, across almost all the events where we had a plummet down, right? Other people rose to the occasion. It's actually an opportunity to rise above, right? And it's quite funny because some of the best trainers in my previous company now were actually the guys managing the sound effects, the MP3s and all that, right? And distributing notebooks and pens to the students when we were running courses in schools. And to them, they watched everything for a long time, but then to ask them to go on stage and deliver a presentation, they were frozen, man. So they were terrible at first, but then now they're fantastic, right? I've seen that kind of growth happen, and I think if we look at failure and bad times, disaster, as sort of like the fertilizer for new sprouts, I think that's another way to look at it. Because I always tell people, like, when you get stuck in life, why are you stuck in life? You're stuck because your perspective is stuck. And the only way to unstuck it is to have conversations with different people, to have a network, to have mentors, to have coaches, to have watch podcasts like this, and to get a different way of looking at things, and then lean into the philosophy, because everybody is a philosopher at heart. But what you philosophize could be disastrous, or it could be a path to victory. So I feel that too many people are using their sense of imagination to just create a reality that totally sucks.
Agree.
So we have to shift ourselves, and it's a deliberate effort to do that. But as with all things, stepping out of the comfort zone, learning how to do whatever it takes in the right fashion, and pursuing passion in the right balance, contrary to our likelihood of burning out. I'm pretty sure on YouTube there'll be some people who say, "Oh, Stuart, you're glorifying failure and glorifying mistakes." I'm not. I'm just saying that this is a natural pathway. There is no such person who succeeds a lot. In fact, I think Bill Gates was quoted saying that success is a very poor teacher, because you hardly learn anything from success. But it doesn't mean that mistakes are the only way to learn lessons. You know what I'm saying? So you can learn lessons from the failures of other people. You can learn some lessons from success. I'm sure Bill Gates was exaggerating when he says, it's a very poor teacher. I'm sure it still teaches us certain things, right? So it's a balance now. How do we actually get to that balance, and how do we ensure that we find a practical pathway to execute in what we do? Not everybody runs a business, then you apply it in your relationships. Not everybody has an intimate relationship, then you apply it to your family relationships or your social relationships. Maybe that doesn't happen very well, then you apply it to other parts of maybe you join a charity and you test things out. So that's what we mean by being able to put yourself out into the world. The last thing you really want is to hide from the world, because it's easy, depression, fear, all of this can drag you down. So rather than letting that hold you away from what you should be doing, you really should double down the efforts on going out rather than staying inside.
That makes sense. I think that having that self-awareness as well, I think is so important to really reflect about what's truly important to you, so that you can actually fail forwards, rather than being stuck in that rut that you are in. And I think to add on as well, when you mention about how going out there to get new perspectives, maybe in the form of a podcast like this, books, mentors, is so important. I think some people, or most people in fact, right, even in my experience many, many years ago, I felt that I could do it all by myself. I felt that I need to experience it by myself. But one thing that we tend to forget is that time is always working against us. Sure, we might be young, we might feel that we have a lot of time, but we must always remember that our loved ones are aging by the minute, and sometimes accelerating your process, accelerating your path to success, whatever success looks like to you, is so important, because then you can give more of what you are and to those that are important to you, right? Like some of us who are watching this are probably like entrepreneurs, wanting to make a difference for the world and maybe even for their world. So quickly learning and avoiding the potential mistakes would be so valuable, right? Having said that, you are also, running an entrepreneurial company. You are also a NLP coach and also a consultant to many different people and organizations, right? Tell us a little bit more about what are the critical challenges that has helped you to learn and grow and become who you are today. Yeah.
I think I've been very blessed with early terrifying experiences or bad experiences. So whenever disappointments actually come, or experiences where I feel like the world is unfair and all that, I'm glad that it happened when I was much younger, so that there was some honing process to make myself more mature. It's funny because you mentioned I'm a consultant. I'm a leadership consultant and an executive coach, right? Would I be a better leadership coach if I had no negative experiences in leadership? I think that would be quite one-sided. Then I'll have certain expectations that are just not realistic, in my opinion. So what makes a difference in being a coach, in my opinion, is that, and I found this to be quite funny as well, there are situations where I am coaching the person, right? And as they're telling me the problem, at the back of my mind it's like, oh, I've been through that before. And it makes it so much easier for me to relate to them. So I find that the best coach is a person who's so empathetic because they've gone through those same things before. Therefore, there's no point judging you. There's no point being critical of you. There's no point telling you, hey, you shouldn't be doing X, you should be doing Y. My experience with leadership, for example, was just like that. Right? I told you that in my teenage years in the Students' Council, I suffered from biased attitudes by the students, not for anything else. And because of that experience, it forced me to have to stand up to bias and allow me to be less judgmental. When talking about professionally, I've made so many bad decisions. I tell people that my bad decisions have been less problematic, right? So last time I would lose $600,000. Now I'll lose maybe $20,000. So I've improved in that sense, because sometimes you just choose the wrong people to work with, and then sometimes you just interact with the people whom are seemingly on the outside well-meaning, but actually they're not. So it's a discernment process. It actually sharpens your way of thinking. One specific instance was, there was a guy whom I started working with, and it was quite interesting to see how he would persuade you. He would tell you, hey, you're good at this. And I was quite sold into that, right? But he didn't lift a single finger. He was just talking only. Up to a certain point, I was going like, hey, what are you supposed to be doing? And then he said this phrase which really irked me. He said, but I'm providing leadership, he said. He said, I'm providing leadership. Providing leadership doesn't mean you're sitting in a corner and just shaking your legs, So I found that hilarious, and then I said, okay, that's it. And I can't believe I poured so much sweat, blood, and to hear you say this. So I remember being resentful at that point of time, but I realized that for every problem you overcome, sometimes there's something deeper. It's got nothing to do with the external circumstances. It's got to do with your own personality. So I believe that all of these experiences are like mirrors. These mirrors are held up due to the circumstances in your life back to you. So you're judgmental of somebody, something is going on inside of you, right? You make a wrong decision, you blame the other person, it's got to do with you. If you end up circumstantially, someone starts lying about you, it's got to do with you eventually. I'm not saying that that's the cause of the issue, right? But it is part of the responsibility you have to take in order to get to that next level.
I agree. I fully agree with you as well. I think like a lot of times, there are things that are outside of our control, but no matter how out of control something might be, I always believe that it is our responsibility to do the necessary actions to overcome whatever situation it is. Circumstantially, it might not be something that's ideal, right? But it's always our responsibility to use the experience to grow so that you can take it to the next level, right? So I think that there are two kinds of people. One that, plays the blame game, and another ones that, play the responsibility game, right? It's not your fault, but it's always your responsibility to work through it, right? I think that what you share about empathy is also so important. As a fellow coach myself, a lot of times people think that, oh, I'm that guy who is like so fit, so healthy, so genetically fit or whatever. But the reality of it is that I had to go through a lot of challenges as well, which is why I feel that, the difference between a coach and like an instructor is not about giving more information. Sometimes all a coach needs to do is just to listen, to act as a mirror, to bounce back to that other person, and then the person will realize, right? So coaches don't actually do all the talking all the time. They don't provide all the information. But one thing I really like about what you do, right, is that you help to create transformation, right? We help people to see the growth in themselves, to see the situations that they need to take responsibility for, right? Like even myself as well, recently, or the past 2 years, I was actually going through a really, really tough time, right? And particularly as well due to my shoulder, right? I injured myself. Back then, I thought that, oh shit, the world has ended, right? Because my identity of myself, just like how your business earlier, the one before you lost the 600,000, you thought that, hey, we cannot fail, right? We are always at the top. When everything starts crashing down, you tend to question yourself, right? So I like what you say as well, when we fail earlier in our journey because it hones our skills to become more mature, right? And that gave me that maturity as well to realize that, sure, while I may not look like the ideal version of myself or what I portrayed myself to be all that many years, it actually gave me a sense of, or rather a bigger perspective, a larger perspective, to be more empathetic, because now I've gone through a more challenging period of my life to be able to be more empathetic to somebody else.
Yeah, I like what I hear. The issue of locking oneself to one's identity to the thing we do is probably one of the things that I learned a long time ago. I mean, if I remember when I was first starting out in training, right, I was supposed to be this guru, right? Because everybody will say, oh, you are up there already. But truth be told, it's like, that's nothing. Because there's always another higher mountain, so to speak, right, in the Chinese proverb. So when we think of ourselves as the highest, the problem is we are actually the lowest. We are too arrogant or egotistical. And I had to learn how to unpack and unburden my ego. And it happened in many, many cycles. So from relationship, so I was divorced separated 2013, divorced 2016. And the process was a very surreal experience also in a negative way, because I had to question my own identity. I had to figure out what was wrong with me. And then maybe it was also like blaming. I call it ABCDE: avoid, blame, complain, deny, and make excuses. So you ABCDE all the way through. And I've come to realize that actually maybe just because I am right doesn't mean you're wrong. And maybe it's the best thing that has ever happened. So it's funny, when you take perspective, failure can be your pivot point towards success. And it also forced me to realize that there's always a living paradox. Like, you encountered a paradox. You are a fitness trainer, coach, encountering a physically debilitating situation. I was a psychologist and like trainer in communication, man. Then, wow, your communication at home sucks. So it tells me that everything is contextual. You're great in certain areas, but you're poor in some other areas. And what's worse, probably that one was more hitting the core of my identity. There was one period of time I was depressed because of my dad passed away in earlier part of 2019 before the lockdown. And at first I didn't think very much of it, but it did hit me after some time. And I ended up doing some stupid things, drinking too much and so on. And I remember seeking out my counselor. So my counselor, being the person she is, she'll sit me down and start asking me questions and so on, with no judgment. And I think that was a great experience, really, to know that you've got the social support and the professional support to get you through. So I remember cancelling one of my trainings, and I was talking to my HR partner. I said, I'm not really feeling very good. Then she said, what do you mean you're a psychologist? It's like as if a doctor cannot fall sick, you know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
So I found it a little bit strange how people view this whole wellness thing, because I doubt that you'll always be well or at the top of your game. So there are ups and down days, but you find a way to manage it. And I've been pursuing down the line of how do we arrive at self-mastery at a faster pace, maybe in a better pace, especially when we're at our down days. And all I can say is that when you can't help yourself, you got to find other people who can help you. The challenge is, how do you do your exams? You ask the other person sitting behind you. You couldn't, right? You get thrown out of the exam hall, right? But that's supposed to be collaboration, isn't it? But we've been training ourselves, at least for the first 16 years of our life, that is cheating.
Yeah, you can only do it by yourself,
that's
you're
crazy.
alone,
You should be doing it collaboratively. That's why I believe that a network is essential. That's one of the reasons why we are building an entrepreneurial network. That's why I believe that social support and psychological support all come from a group of people who understand you and won't criticize you. They won't tell you like, oh, that sucks or that's terrible, because they've walked that path before. They don't want others to criticize you. So that's what the network is meant to be for, to be a little bit more empathetic and to share the burdens together, right? There are so many additional terrifying things that could happen in life that I feel that there's no point worrying about it. I mean, for all you know, you get robbed or kidnapped or something like that. But there's no point worrying about it. You just need to be able to live life the way it is. Circumstances will come and go, right? So I still remember, I can't remember what's her name right now, but I think her surname is White. She was abducted by someone and then raped multiple times. And then she stood on the TED stage and shared her experience. It must have been terrifying to be able to be so vulnerable. Which is why I lean into a lot of the research, the psychological research that enables people to get not just physically stronger, but psychologically stronger and emotionally together. When I kind of like fell apart, I couldn't help but realize that I fell apart at the right time during the lockdown. So it was like, that was the best time for me, and I couldn't be more thankful for it.
Like to reflect, have
Yeah,
that time
precisely.
on your own.
Nobody was bothering me.
Correct.
It
And-
also, yeah.
Yeah, and to add on as well, just now you mentioned about how a lot of times people think that doctors cannot fall sick, right? Psychologists cannot feel down. But I think the difference to me, those who are masterful at what they do, is not that they cannot fail, but is that they know how to manage their mistakes. They know how to manage their failure to bounce back.
Yes. Yeah.
To bounce
agree.
back, I think that's the most important, right? To go through whatever adversity and still have the ability to press on and overcome it and to grow and to, internalize the experience so that you can have more to give, whatever your craft is. Right?
I just want to add a point to this. I think there are two groups of people in the world today. I think those where the problems have occurred to them and they've overcome it. And they feel that they internally have the power and the choice to get out of it. But then there's another group that feels that that's just circumstantial, right? Whatever happens to me is just, someone else's fault, or it's like heaven's will or something like that, and they cannot take responsibility. So I cite this example because I think it's a very unfortunate example of how the young currently think. And I don't know why. When I was still going to schools to run training programs, I no longer do that. But back in the day, I tended to favor the students who were from the normal technical and normal academic stream. Because for some reason, they seem to be more empathetic and they are not so egotistical. Whereas there are many of them, I'm not saying all of them, from the express and the so-called special streams, they tended to be so as if they knew everything, like know it all. And I suspect that the streaming process didn't really help them very much. Example, where do I get the warmest thank yous? I get the warmest thank yous from those who are not academically inclined, to be honest. Those who are academically inclined, it touches their head, but it doesn't touch their heart, So my feeling there was like, why is this the case? And I suspect it's because those who have not suffered at an early age, they wouldn't develop emotional intelligence and a sense of a warm heart earlier on.
And the empathy as well, right?
Precisely. So I'm not wishing any of the bad stuff to happen, but like you say, it needs to be worked into a system of resilience. So you need to be able to recognize that there's something that's happening and to pick yourself up, or at least talk yourself through it. I did some research on self-talk, so I can share a little bit about this. There's a difference between the self-talk that is spontaneous. Like sometimes you realize that, something happened to your arm, and then you go like, oh shit, that's a spontaneous reaction to an event. Similar to the 600K loss. Spontaneous. But the spontaneous self-talk seems to serve a mechanism. So when you talk to yourself, oh shit, it's a feedback mechanism. So somehow your body is attuned to give you feedback, right? Question is, are you listening? Most people are not listening. You know why? Because they drink alcohol, they take Panadol, they do all of those things to numb themselves, and they take, and sugar. Sugar is the number one number, right? You heard about the whole thing about
dopamine, all that, right?
Yeah, like the sugar cravings come back because they are down, and then they eat to feel good, right? To feel a part of themselves, but it's temporary. So I realized that the self-talk mechanism, number one, functions as feedback. Number two, it functions as instructional and strategic. So for example, feel down. So you talk to yourself, okay, slowly remove the weight, okay, hold your arm together, make sure you tuck in, okay, quickly go and call. Because you may be in such pain. That's the only thing that will guide you, your own internal coach, so to speak. Okay, do this, step 1, step 2, step 3. Anyone who's broken their arm before, they will consciously look at it and go like, okay, it's broken. But they don't feel anything yet because they ain't come yet. So once the pain starts coming in, then they can't think anymore. So it's like a conscious effort. Okay, do this, do this, do this. Performance sports is like that. The golfer will think, okay, I need to hit this. Okay, we need to go there, right? What's in between? Okay, can I do this? Okay, let's do this technique. Let's use this particular driver. And they work through it, right? So the problem with most people is that they don't know what to do. They stumble through it because they are not learned in a sense of doing in order to get to the end outcome. That's known as a mastery experience. So take for example, when I was first standing up on stage and trying to deliver a presentation. When I was in primary school, the traumatic experience, I call it traumatic, it's not really a trauma. Okay? The teacher asked me to stand up and read a book, but I was freaking scared, you know what I'm saying? So The first time that happened, I tried to read, nothing came out of my mouth. I think the teacher got a little bit impatient and just passed me over. Said, okay, you continue from him. And I never got my chance. But that's what people do. When you fail, they say you are a failure. Actually, you just failed the action. You are not a failure. That's not your identity. And therefore, I needed to find a way to pick myself back up by learning how to do it. So I did it in small measure. I stood up for 5 minutes at a time, 3 minutes at a time, and I got better at it. And that's known as a mastery experience. Then now, if I have to sit down in front of anybody to do a 4-hour experience, right? Okay, let's do it. 8-hour. I mean, our record was 16 hours speaking non-stop, right? Throughout the day. Well, not really non-stop. We had half-hour breaks and tea breaks and stuff like that. But it became a joy. Do you know why?
Why?
Oh, I realized this and it was an epiphany. You don't like the things that you're not good at. Because if you're good at it, you'll always like it.
True.
So you got to start from not liking it because you're no good, accept it, and then start doing it.
It's
then
like
you get good.
It's like unconscious competency, you know?
Yeah,
you know that
that's
whole,
right.
whole theory?
Yeah,
About
but I think people who give up, they are giving up way too early. It's like, put in that effort, man. Go and do it. I've told myself many times that there's a necessity to just stretch yourself, push yourself, right? But a lot of people don't understand, why do you have to push yourself? I'm seeing the future, and I'm seeing that at 70 years old, do I want to be physically ill? Do I want to go to a hospital? Which, number one, is costly. Number two, there are other people who have got more severe diseases. If I can prevent it, why would I want to go there?
Agree. And I think that one of the best ways to actually, push yourself to grow is to really understand what the future might be with or without the thing that you're trying to push yourself to grow. One thing that I tell a lot of people as well in terms of your health and your fitness is that whatever experiences you want in your life, you can only experience it with this one body that you have. No matter how amazing your dreams are, if your body can't bring you there, experience, then it's gonna be it's gonna be very tough. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Right, Stuart. Thank you so much for sharing about your story and the different challenges that you've gone through as well. If let's say, right, you could distill down, some lessons for the people who are watching this and listening to this as well, what would you say, the top 3 advice you would give them right now for personal mastery, for overcoming the challenges, and to become the best version of themselves?
I would say always be learning. That's the number one thing. If you're constantly learning, you get an opportunity to learn things that you never knew. They may not be new techniques, but they may be things that are nuances that could move the needle. So in business, the reason why business people hang around other business people, it's not as if I don't know what business is. It's that there's just that 1%, the unique information that makes it a wow for you, and then you can implement it. And I think that is something that most people don't lean into. Learning to them is tedious because they thought that learning is studying the way you used to study in school. But that's not the case. I think learning can take so many different forms. Learning from mentors, learning from a network, learning from books, learning from podcasts. There's so much that can be gathered. And I think it needs to be done as a recurring, never-ending cycle. Okay, so that's probably the first one at the top of my mind. The second one, I would say that incorporating mistakes into your system of resiliency. Let's put it this way, nobody ever expected the pandemic to take place. If it did, I'll be a really, really rich man by now, right? So I never anticipated it. Those of us who are well-placed, we were luckier than others. And in order for us to take things to the next level, right, we really have to embrace the mistakes. The mistakes that happen to us are not happening to us. They're actually happening for us.
I love that, right? Life happens for us,
Precisely.
not to us.
Yeah, I love to emphasize this point because if we are at a low level of resiliency, it means that we have not learned from our mistakes yet. And whatever the case in life, there's always going to be a bigger problem because we're growing. And when we grow, we're going to elevate to even higher levels of problems. And hopefully the smaller problems would have given you the grounding to say, okay, this one may look big, but I've dealt with similar things before and I'll be able to move forward. Incorporating mistakes into your system of resiliency is a must. How do you work with your mind? How do you work with your heart? How do you work with your social energies and social support network in order to bring resourcefulness for the future? The last one, which is not really the last one, is starting with a base. What is the base? I think in life, the base is physical well-being. If you're not physically well, you can't be emotionally well. If you're not physically well, I don't think you can mentally muster focus. If you ask me, it's got to do with the various elements of physical well-being, which is strength, stamina or endurance, nutrition, sleep, and flexibility. In fact, there's one more, probably speed. So if we got these 6, I think it will help us in a manner that will open up more opportunities for us. Because I mean, you can have a fantastic business network, but you can't attend the network. You know, you're at home because you fell sick very regularly, and too often I think people forget that physical fitness itself is a skill. Physical well-being is a skill. They think that, oh, he's got it, he's talented and all that. I never once believed that talent is the thing. Everything that someone is talented in has been a skill that they've incorporated into their unconscious awareness.
Yep.
And that makes the biggest difference.
Awesome, man. I mean, I love that. I really like all these 3 tips, and it really resonates a lot with me as well. And I hope that if you're watching this and you're listening to this, you're getting a lot of value from today's session. And of course, Stuart, thank you so much. So where can our listeners and people watching this find you?
Oh, okay. They can head down to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Stuart Tan. That's with 2 T's. And you can head down to stuarttan.com just to read more about me and get more insights. I typically do daily videos. Hopefully that doesn't screw up. but yeah, I do my best to live into my mission. I find that the mission of each individual is going to have to be about impact. So my key thing is to help raise people beyond the level of suffering and challenges that they face so that they'll be able to take actions for abundance.
Amazing. Well, there you go, guys. So thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of the Press On podcast. So I look forward to seeing you in the next video. I'll speak to you soon. Cheers.